We begin tonight's broadcast with a breaking news story that's due to send shockwaves throughout the nation. A cult leader and YouTube star has been arrested in connection with a series of brutal murders. Francisco Leitão was initially linked to the disappearance of a 16-year-old girl, but new evidence that was obtained by police linked him to the grisly homicides.
At the start of 2010, a YouTube channel by the name of Nostradamus Portugal began to post a series of bizarre videos to the platform. The channel, named after the famous French astrologer, focused on content surrounding what was described as the 2012 phenomena. For those of you who don't know, in the mid-2000s, information began to circulate online that the world was going to end on the 21st of December 2012 because an ancient Mayan calendar was coming to an end. This theory, as many of you will know, ended up in the mainstream and sent many into a panic. The reality of the situation was much different. You see, the Mayans hadn't even predicted anything. Their calendar was just ending and a new one was beginning. Nostradamus Portugal ran with this theory and would even take it one step further. The man behind the account was 42-year-old Francisco Leitão, and in one of his videos, he would tell the audience that not only would the world end in 2012, but rather a devastating earthquake would hit his home country of Portugal in August of 2010.
Muito bom dia, o meu nome é Francisco Leitão, futuro rei Grob, para a nova era, o novo mundo. A 22 de dezembro do ano 2012. O comentário que eu venho aqui deixar neste preciso momento é o seguinte. Hoje, dia 8 de fevereiro do ano 2010, faltam 6 meses até chegar ao dia 8 de agosto do ano 2010, dia em que está previsto, até mesmo já estudado pela ciência portuguesa, de que há um terremoto que vai acontecer em Portugal. Cerca de 76% da margem costeira será destruída. Nós não podemos permitir que 76% da margem costeira de Portugal, de norte a sul, seja destruído. O que é que será dos nossos pescadores, da população portuguesa? O que será da vida marítima? O que será de nós todos, que neste preciso momento estamos em Portugal? Ora, nós podemos nos juntar, lançar a nossa ira cá para fora, a nossa força, pedir aos portugueses que não entrem em pânico, que não entrem em caos, não entrem em stress. Vamos tentar chegar ao dia 8 de agosto e que não seja o fim do mundo, como já estão neste preciso momento a querer anunciar através de alguns canais de comunicação social. Nós vamos tentar lutar. Eu próprio vou lutar, eu próprio vou ajudar para que no dia 8 de agosto do ano 2010 não aconteça este terremoto que está previsto acontecer em Portugal, que destruirá cerca de 76% da faixa costeira. Terremoto que vai ser pior do que o terremoto de 1755 que destruiu a cidade de Lisboa. Nessa altura, um terremoto de tal dimensão, a cidade foi destruída de tal ordem que hoje encontra-se num caos total. A cidade de Lisboa, se tiver um pequeno terremoto, pode ser destruída a qualquer tipo de momento. Está em cima de um lençol de água, suportada. Alguns dos prédios existentes, os seus pilares são apenas de madeira. Pilares de madeira, onde hoje os pilares se fazem em betão armado, ou até mesmo em ferro. Por isso eu peço à população portuguesa para não entrar em pânico. E peço a todos os portugueses que se encontram na margem costeira, de norte a sul de Portugal continental, que não entrem em pânico, não entrem em stress. Vamos tentar deitar alguns bens em segurança, colocá-los em segurança, para que no dia 8 o terremoto não aconteça. Caso alguém tenha medo que tudo isso vai acontecer, está previsto, mas eu vou lutar para que esse terremoto não aconteça. Eu vou deitar a minha ira cá para fora, eu vou deitar o meu poder cá para fora, e o terremoto não pode acontecer de forma alguma. Não pode haver mais uma destruição de cerca de 76% ao nível da faixa costeira de norte a sul de Portugal continental. Esse terremoto, ao acontecer, até as nossas ilhas, Açores e Madeira, São Miguel, etc., podem sofrer. E nós não queremos isso. Não queremos o que aconteceu neste preciso momento no Haiti. Não queremos que aconteça em Portugal. Nós não nos encontramos preparados. Eu posso estar preparado, para tal dimensão, para tal coisa, mas vocês não vão estar preparados. O meu poder de energia pode não ser o suficiente para conseguir impedir que o Deus Rei ficou faça um terremoto de tal dimensão para destruir cerca de 76% da faixa costeira. Portanto, vamos evitar. Eu peço à população para não entrar em pânico. Caso tenha medo, com a aproximação dos dias, que faltam 6 meses em ponto, porque hoje é dia 8 de fevereiro, se tiveres medo, que tenha medo, alguns dos bens materiais que estejam mais à beira da faixa costeira, podes retirar para um local muito mais seguro. Tudo pode acontecer, mas nós vamos impedir que o terremoto não aconteça a 8 de agosto do ano 2010. Já nos basta a 22 de dezembro do ano 2012 o mundo acabar, ir para a nova era, começar um novo mundo. Eu também não vou permitir que isso aconteça a 22 de dezembro do ano 2012. Eu vou impedir que o mundo acabe nesse dia também, como vou impedir que a 8 de agosto do ano 2010 aconteça um terremoto ao nível de Portugal inteiro. Eu peço à população para ter calma, em meu nome e em nome de toda a gente que vai lutar. Nós vamos pedir à população portuguesa para que mantenha a calma. Vamos manter a calma, meus amigos.
Although these videos seem harmless, that's far from the truth, and the man you're looking at right now can only be described as the personification of evil. Not much is known about Francisco's childhood, but those who do recount some of the more intimate details say that he was one of 4 children, and that the family lived a modest life. As a child, he was said to have been well behaved, helped out where he could, and would have an excellent attendance during his school years. His family owned a home in the small village of Carheia, Lorena, but as you know, the modest life meant they weren't well off by any means. So instead of being a housewife like most were during that period, Francisco's mother opted to work. That way the family could live a more comfortable life. His father was the main breadwinner. He owned some farmland a short distance away from the village, which served the local areas. When Francisco was in the 4th grade, tragedy hit. His father ended up in a work-related accident, which resulted in an amputated leg. After the accident, all of the children had to drop out of school to help bring in the cash. Even though he dropped out, Francisco was sociable, and believe it or not, throughout his teens and early adult years, he found himself in many different relationships. When he was 24, he would go on to marry a woman by the name of Rosa Nunez, a girl from his village. The pair were in a relationship for 3 years. The marriage, however, lasted just 2 months. There's conflicting reports regarding the breakdown of the marriage. On the one hand, Rosa and her family say that Francisco was abusive towards her the minute the ring was put on her finger. She ultimately stuck around for the sake of the marriage. However, when she caught him in bed with another man, that was the final nail in the coffin. On the other hand, Francisco would say that she refused to help when his mother was dying, so he wanted her gone. Whatever the case, the pair would eventually divorce. By 2004, both of Francisco's parents had sadly passed away. It's unclear what most of the inheritance was, but we do know that both the farmland and home were left to the children. The farmland was eventually sold and the money was split between the 4. However, they kept the house. Francisco and his sister would live there moving forward. There was said to have been a small dispute as the other 2 brothers wanted to sell, but ultimately they kept the property. Francisco launched a lucrative scrap metal company with his portion of the money from the farmland. The business operated across Portugal and even in Spain. When the money started to roll in from the scrap business, he decided that he was going to transform the family home into a makeshift castle. My great-great-grandparents were royals in Vigo, Spain. When the Civil War broke out, they had to leave the country. My grandparents told me that I had royal blood running through my veins, so I transformed the house into a castle to match my royal title. What should be noted though is that there's no evidence to suggest that was even remotely true. Word began to spread that a castle had been built in the area, and the man who lived there was some kind of warlock or wizard, so many teens set out on hunting for it. Remember, the internet wasn't commonplace, especially in poor villages in Portugal in the early 2000s. So when they caught wind of this alleged castle and Warlock, they had to go and check it out for themselves. But where did these rumours of Francisco being a warlock even come from? Well, what happened was, when these teens arrived, he told them about his family lineage and how, according to history books, he was the current king. Not just any old king though, rather the Gnome King, a mystical goblin who guarded the hidden treasures of the earth. He revealed to them that he also had magical powers, discovered that he could communicate with spirits, and at times those spirits would be able to incarnate within him. Those who bought the story told their friends about this paranormal experience they had while at the castle with Francisco, and so the birth of the rumours began. The castle became known in the local area as a social spot for teens and young adults. Most who were regular visitors often came from broken homes and were poor, so when Francisco gave them money from time to time, took them on days out, paid for food and drinks, and sometimes even handed them a brand new mobile phone, it gave them more of an incentive to keep returning. It looked then as if Francisco, out of the pure kindness of his heart, took these young ones under his wing to help them out in life. However, ladies and gentlemen, that was far from the truth. You see, he was in fact grooming them to become members of his cult. There wasn't a specific message that the cult tried to push, so we don't exactly know why it formed. Many believe it was just Francisco wanting to control a group of young people. The cult would participate in various black magic rituals and animal sacrifices. Those who still weren't convinced that Francisco was a warlock would be taken to a cemetery at night, and while there, the spirits who Francisco said he communicated with would show up. Spoiler alert though, it was just adult members of the cult dressed in a costume. These visits were enough to convince all members that Francisco wasn't lying.
Não dá para entrar, tem que ser ali embaixo.
Foda-se, viste o posto agora? Esse dia, mané. Então, olha cá, olha aí. Ai, Jesus. Miguel, olha aí. Olha aí, eu vou todos. Estás a ver? Olha aí, ao teu lado. Ao teu lado.
Não, contigo, Fernando. Ai, segura aí, Fernando.
Não! Achei que estava sacando!
Mas eu estou à procura da chave!
Foda-se!
Onde é que... O bicho está onde? O coisa está onde?
O quê? O quê? O quê? Meu coração! Barulho negativa!
Caralho, meu coração!
Caiu então!
Achei!
Joga aqui! Ou então, quando eu olhei para aquilo, sabes onde é que ele estava? Sabes onde é que ele estava? Ele está de cima, acabou de olhar para mim.
Caralho, mas eu não vi, pá!
Porquê que ele está mascarado?
Olha para esta merda!
Tu não viste aquilo ao teu lado?
Não!
Ele estava-te a segurar.
Mas estava que olha como está o casaco! Olha para isto! Mas o que é que eu não fiquei?
Olha, eu disse ao teu lado.
Eu não vi nada!
Então, ó, eu olhei para lá, eu não vi nada. Eu digo assim, fiquei aqui de novo, motherfucker, e aquilo apareceu.
Hoje aqui tenho que parar no
Aquilo não sai do cemitério.
Tu tens que pensar, não.
Mas porquê é que ele estava mascarado? Aquilo não é mascarado, aquilo é mesmo assim, está materializado.
Aquilo é materializado.
Foi assim que eu vi na outra vez dois, nas gueiras, com a Flávia. Tipo, porquê é que ele estava assim? Vamos lá outra vez? Não. Então, bora lá os dois.
Bora lá.
Eu vou lá mais vocês, mas eu vou.
Ó Fernando. Não.
Então deixa o carro aberto, ninguém vai mexer no carro, a gente está ali.
Ó Fernando, anda lá.
Foda-se que ele agarrou-me! Mas estava a ver que baldeava para o muro abaixo, caralho!
Achas que dá para filmar? Dá.
Ó Fernando, a gente não se aproxima. A gente não se
Eu a
aproxima.
chamar o caralho, ninguém me garrafa!
Anda mais eu não vou mais tu, eu vou mais eu então.
Epá, nem tenho quilhões outra vez. Oh, pá.
Oh, então, eu nunca tive a disparada. Mete a mão no meu coração.
Pois não.
Oh, Vlad, já viste como é que ficou a minha manga? Olha para esta merda.
Eu estou a tremer todas as pernas.
Oh, Daniel, já repara para as mangas.
Deus, puta. Olha o puto. O puto está a tremer por todo lado.
Olha para as mangas.
Bora. Eu agarro-te nos dois.
E arranhei-me aqui. É para uma coisa gelada.
Sei que eu te empurrasse para dentro. Eu ia puxá-la, só que depois ela...
Eu fiquei parado, eu fiquei parado.
É,
Eu
mas
até fiquei
ali-
com...
Mas sei que eu puxasse para dentro. Então, eu olho para dentro do cemitério,
Mas eu não vi nada,
Eu assim, CJ aqui com o guarda-fogo. Quando olho assim, eu...
Ih, caralho, fica grande.
Bora, temos que vê-lo outra vez. Anda, bora.
Vou, caralho, que eu vou, foda-se, olha você.
Então,
Oh, Fernando, anda lá que...
Foda-se, foi tu que sentiste.
Deixa-me dar uma passada.
Aquela merda estava gelada para não sei o que, nem sei...
Tu é um morto.
É, pá, por caralho, não. Eu esta noite já não durmo, caralho.
Isso, olha ver isto.
Puto,
Ó, ainda tinhas medo, aquilo não faz nada. Tu olhas para aquilo,
não sou capaz.
viste que eu só agarro ela. Tu olhas para aquilo. O que é que ele estava assim a abanar? Tu olhas para aquilo. Então aquilo é.
É, pá, está calada aquela
É
merda.
que eu nem consegui ver direito
Olha
porque eu
para
queria
isto.
olhar para a câmara para tentar fixar na câmara.
Olha
Não
que
estava.
eu faço.
Aquilo parecia um gajo mascarado de carnaval. Não é mesmo
Ué, o caralho.
É materializado.
Olha que se ele te agarrar, tu vais ver. A sensação que tu apanhas, caralho.
Então, não vamos entrar
É pá, ó Chico.
Não.
Se é fodido mais, então.
É muito fodido, cara, que ele anda mesmo aí à solta, pá. Não vês que é
Bora
lua
lá,
cheia,
bora lá,
pá.
então.
É lua cheia, Chiquinho.
Bora, Miguel.
Mas eu agora ela para frente. Ih,
Ai, o telefone! Ai, que cagaço! Ai, que caralho de
estou a dar tremer.
Então, será que o fantasma percebe inglês?
Não sei.
Os fantasmas estão a ligar para ti.
When the followers were fully on board, Francisco would let them in on his secret teaching. He told them that all humans had a negative version of themselves, whose sole purpose it was to destroy them. This negative energy could also kill family and friends. However, he did offer a way to stop this from happening, and that was to maintain a level of positive energy in the body. The way to maintain this positive energy was through something called an energy injection. In other words, the act of Francisco ejaculating inside of them. Members were fearful of the consequences that this negative energy would bring, so they allowed themselves to be raped by him. In January of 2010, Francisco would start to post videos on YouTube with the intention of not only reinforcing the idea that he had some sort of magical powers, but also to recruit new members to the cult. As we explained earlier on in the video, the 2012 phenomena swept the globe, and Francisco used that to promote himself as the world's savior. If you joined his cult, you'd help him in his fight against the earthquake that was about to hit Portugal and against Rekifel, aka Lucifer, who was threatening to destroy the world.
Amigos e caros concidadãos ao nível do mundo inteiro, eu sou o Leitão, mestre grobe sábio, venho aqui dizer que estou preparado para o fim do mundo que se aproxima já no dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012. Para começar uma nova era no dia 22 de dezembro do ano 2012. Eu estou preparado, mas tu não estás preparado para a evolução que o mundo vai sofrer. Os meteoritos que vão cair sobre a Terra, os asteroides que vão cair sobre a Terra, as guerras que nós temos, as batalhas que foram enfrentadas, nós, todos, não se vamos sentir preparados, pelo menos alguns. Os que restarem, quando os novos governantes descerem dos céus e vierem à terra proclamar, e eles quererem proclamar o que lhes pertence, eles ganharão. Nós temos que lançar a nossa ira cá para fora, a nossa força, e eu vou tentar lançar essa força cá para fora, porque no dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012, eu não permito que o mundo acabe nesse dia. Eu não permito ainda que a nova era comece no dia 22 de dezembro do ano 2012. Eu peço a vocês atenção para que nessas datas lancem vossas energias. O nosso corpo é magnético o livro Nostradamus, o livro mágico, tem as profecias, os maias, ao longo de milhões de anos, eles têm as profecias dos acontecimentos maus e bons que aconteceram ao nível do nosso mundo inteiro, ao nível do nosso planeta. Eu vou experimentar lançar a minha ira cá para fora, a minha energia cá para fora, e tentar provar a vocês que dentro do nosso corpo existe magnetismo. Por isso, eu não permito que o mundo acabe no dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012. Do meu lado direito tenho aqui um amigo, o Daniel, que tem 16 anos. Ele não está pronto para enfrentar o fim do mundo no dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012. Vai ter 19 anos na altura. O Nelson, que está aqui, na altura vai ter 30. E eu vou ter 44 anos. Eu estou preparado, mas eles não estão. Portanto, nem vocês estão preparados para a nova evolução do novo mundo. Eu peço a estes dois amigos que se levantem e que tentem com a tua mão esquerda, a tua esquerda, Nelson, não, neste caso é a tua direita. Peço perdão, peço que tu unas aqui um pouco mais. Eu vou tentar ir um pouco mais para o lado do Daniel. Ali o nosso operador de câmara, o Rui Ferreira, não está com atenção, ele está na brincadeira, está-se a rir, nós estamos a dar uma entrevista. Eu vou tentar fazer de forma e provar a vocês de que o mundo não pode acabar. Eu peço a estes dois irmãos que fechem os olhos, que concentrem suas energias. Ora, aqui vamos nós. Concentrar a energia, deitar o magnetismo cá para fora. O que está a acontecer? A energia que o meu corpo está a lançar junto com dois irmãos. Esta experiência pode pôr fim ao fim do mundo e o início à nova era. Eu estou preparado, mas vocês não estão. Por isso vos peço. Vamos unir as nossas forças e vamos tentar não acabar o mundo. Vamos deixar de ter guerra, fome, os meteoritos que vão cair na Terra, asteroides que vão cair na Terra. No dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012, nós vamos ter que evitar. Nós próprios teremos que lançar cá para fora uma energia e essa energia ser dada a todos, distribuída. Nós, ao fazermos este movimento, criamos uma onda magnética. Uma energia será lançada e vai proteger os humanos que se encontram ao de cima da Terra. Por isso, irmãos, vamos acabar com a guerra, com a fome. Vamos partir para um mundo novo. Mas não permitam que no dia 21 de dezembro do ano 2012 o mundo acabe. É o que eu vos peço.
In case you were wondering, yes, many of the people in the local area thought that it was extremely odd that a fully grown adult was hanging around with young teenagers and was allowing them to visit his home on a near enough daily basis. Those people didn't know exactly what was going on inside the house, but they had a feeling that something nefarious was taking place. It's to no surprise they had those feelings because everyone knew of previous allegations that were made against Francisco. Those allegations? Sex crimes against children. Francisco would be the focus of 3 separate police investigations over those allegations between 2002 and 2009, but all were shelved due to a lack of evidence. However, that wasn't the last time he would end up on the police's radar, and in 2010, he would be the focus of another investigation that would ultimately lead to his thankful demise. During late 2008, a 16-year-old boy named in report as just Luis began to hear rumours from friends that a warlock with magical powers had lived just a short distance from his home. Curious, he went to investigate. When he arrived, he was welcomed with open arms and was shown around the place. Francisco then read through some magic literature with him, and finally, a magic trick was performed. On that occasion, he made a bouquet of flowers move by themselves. From that moment moving forward, Luis was hooked. Francisco could see that he instantly fell for the lie, and to reinforce the belief that he had magical powers, he told Luis that he was being haunted by an entity called 88, and that he would prove this to him later that night. So, when the sun went down, the pair headed over to the cemetery, and what a surprise, 88 appeared. The encounter was enough for Luis to submit himself to the cult, and within days he was subjected to energy injections. In the summer of 2009, 16-year-old Joana Correia had moved to the Torres Vedras area of Portugal. That's around 19 miles away from the castle. It's never stated how or when Joana met Luis, but the pair would end up in a relationship at some point after her arrival. Luis was said to have attempted to recruit Joana into the cult, and although she frequented the castle, there's no suggestions that she ever fell for Francisco's lies. She told me she didn't like Francisco, she only went to his home because of Luis. Joana's mother, Maria, like many parents in the surrounding areas, knew exactly who Francisco was and how he had been under investigation for sex crimes against children. So when she found out that Luis was going to his home near enough every day, and Joana was being picked up from school by Francisco to meet up with Luis, she banned her from going to the property. However, Joana wouldn't listen to her mother's orders and continued to visit. That wasn't out of the ordinary though, because she was known for being mischievous. Joana's home life was stable, but she would engage in various arguments with her parents, which would ultimately lead to her running away from the home and staying out for days at a time. When she went missing from her home under calmer circumstances then, in March of 2010, Maria knew that something was off. At around 7:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2010, Joana told her mother that she was going to meet her friend Beatrice and that she'd be back later that night. However, she didn't return. Over the next day or so, several messages were sent to Maria from Joana's phone explaining that she had left Portugal voluntarily and asked that no one look for her. Similar messages were also sent to her sister, Katia. Both Maria and Katia would attempt to make contact with Joana, but the device was switched off. Around 4 days after her disappearance, Maria received more messages from Joana's number, giving some more details about her whereabouts. The messages explained that she had left for France with some friends from Porto and that everything was fine. But again, when she tried to reach out, the device was switched off. After those messages were sent, Maria filed a police report with the Portuguese National Republican Guard, as she felt that there was something off about the disappearance. Portuguese law enforcement is made up of several different forces. The National Guard, or GNR for short, are a domestic branch of the army who deal with matters such as search and rescue operations and missing people. The Public Security Police, or PSP for short, are what you would consider your normal type of police force. However, they don't investigate more serious crimes such as kidnappings and murder because the Judiciary Police, or PJ for short, are responsible for that. Maria approached the GNR to see if they could use their expertise in search and rescue to help locate Joana. They were going to take the case on, but when she gave them background information about Joana, they shelved the investigation, citing that she was a rebellious teen who had more than likely just run away from home, like she had done on multiple occasions in the past. Unhappy with the outcome, Maria asked the PSP if they could assist in the search. When the information was presented to them, they took the case more seriously, suggesting that Joana may have been kidnapped. Remember though, they don't investigate kidnapping cases, so they passed it on to the PJ. In the initial days of the investigation, it was established that Joana had been with her friend Beatrice hours before she went missing. So PJ detectives went to her home to question her. I was with Joana at around 1:30 PM on the day she went missing. We met up at a cafe. While we were there, her phone was constantly going off. I asked who was calling and she told me that it was the cousin of her boyfriend, Luis. That cousin was none other than Francisco. Beatrice had met him on a few occasions in the past via Luis and Joana, but when her mother found out she was going to his home, she was warned not to do so anymore. So when Joana told her that she was planning on meeting Francisco later that night to surprise Luis and asked if she wanted to go with her, Beatrice said no. She was okay with me not wanting to go, but she did ask that I not mention anything to anyone because it was supposed to be a surprise for Luis. I remember it felt weird that they were going to surprise him rather than Francisco bringing Luis to surprise Joana. The last Beatrice heard from Joana was at around 10 PM on the 3rd of March 2010. She had sent her a message asking how everything was going and received a response stating that she was on the way to Luis. Francisco was now the PJ's #1 suspect into the potential kidnapping of Joana. However, before making an arrest, they needed some solid evidence against him. That evidence was more than likely stored on her phone. The PJ would approach the court to try and secure a warrant to obtain information from Joana's network. However, for reasons that are never stated, the court delayed the approval of the warrant. Frustrated, Maria approached the network herself, and surprisingly, they handed over the relevant information. Although technically the data was obtained without a search warrant, it was still admissible in court. I called Vodafone, explained what was happening, and they told me that my daughter's SIM card was in a mobile phone that belonged to Ivo Delgado. PJ detectives were left scratching their heads. All the information up until now suggested that Francisco was behind Joana's disappearance, but the evidence now pointed at another man, Ivo Delgado. When investigators turned up at Ivo's last known address, his parents' home, to question him about Joana's disappearance, they would discover something that would leave them more confused than they already were. You see, Ivo's parents would tell them that they hadn't seen or heard from him since June of 2008. He had been missing for nearly 2 years. Ivo had met Francisco back in 2001, when he was just 16 years old. The pair ended up crossing paths during a time when Ivo was looking for work in the local area. Their relationship wasn't exclusively business, it was sexual as well. Francisco had been dating a woman called Gina when he first met Ivo. She had lived across the road from him when they were children and had recently reconnected. Fast forward a few years and Gina fell pregnant with their daughter. After the pregnancy, Gina noticed that Ivo and Francisco were more than just work colleagues. She ended up confronting him about her suspicions, and Francisco confirmed that he was indeed in a sexual relationship with Ivo. He even showed her a video of them having sex with each other. Francisco had been a sweetheart up until that confrontation. After it had taken place, he became abusive towards Gina. He told me that I had to accept that, otherwise he'd kill me and the baby. I tried to flee on several occasions, but he caught me every time. I was basically a hostage in the castle. When the baby was around 6 months old, Gina finally managed to escape. It's believed that her and her daughter now live somewhere in France. Ivo was a bit of a misfit, and as his parents would put it, could at times be quite unstable. So it's to no surprise that when Francisco gave him some stability in his life, he left his parents to go and live with him at the age of 17. It's unclear what role he played in the cult, we'll never truly know, but we do know that he lived at the castle until June of 2008, and then suddenly he ended up going missing. The last we heard, Ivo was in Spain. He had to flee Portugal to escape the police as he was being investigated for drug trafficking and car theft offences. The last time Manuel and Cecilia Delgado had seen their son was June 25th, 2008. By that point, Francisco's scrap business had collapsed and Ivo had been on the hunt for work. The job search would make him reconnect with his family because he wanted to see if they knew of any vacancies, and they did. His dad had some work for him. Ivo had been looking for an opportunity to distance himself from Francisco around that time, as he had been subjected to verbal and physical abuse, so this was a win-win. Ivo's day would go as follows. He would go to his parents' home in the morning and have breakfast with them, then go out to work with his dad, go back to the family home to have dinner, and then in the evening he would go to Francisco and stay at the castle for the night. This routine would go on for months, and then out of nowhere, on June 26th, he stopped showing up at the Delgado family home. A few days after the no-show, Francisco turned up at the home, and it was there he informed the couple that Ivo had fled to Spain. Following this visit, Cecilia and Manuel would receive messages from their son's phone number. They stated that Ivo was fine and was enjoying his time away from Portugal. The couple did try to call the number, but were met with no answer. A few days after that, Francisco turned up at the house again. This time he informed the Delgados that Ivo wouldn't be sending any more messages, and if they needed to contact him, they'd have to go through Francisco, as Ivo had been speaking with him in secret to avoid police detection. They didn't have any reason not to believe him, and if there was any doubts, they were soon crushed because Francisco handed over images of Ivo at various locations across Europe. Shortly after that visit, Francisco returned to the home once again. This time, he handed the Delgados a letter that was said to have been from Ivo. The letter asked if the couple could start making payments to Francisco every week, so that way he could give it to him, to support him while he was on the run. Moving forward, Manuel and Cecilia would start giving Francisco money, but it isn't clear on how much they would give him. As the months went by, Ivo's sister began to have doubts about this story and told her parents to stop paying Francisco. Francisco would cut ties with them after that happened. Very suspicious indeed. The PJ's conversation with the Delgados proved to be a success, and Francisco was their #1 suspect again. Not only in connection with the disappearance of Joana, but Ivo as well. Detectives began to realise that this case was much more complex than first thought, and given the similarities of both disappearances, they wanted to see if they could connect Francisco to any more missing people. They did. On the 30th of May, 2008, 27-year-old Tania Ramos and her 9-year-old daughter Karina were rushed to a local hospital in southwest Portugal. They were both injured as the result of an assault at the hands of Tania's husband, Nuno. Nuno and Tania's marriage had been on the rocks for a couple of years leading up to the assault, and believe it or not, May 30th was supposed to be the day when the divorce paperwork was signed. However, when Tania didn't show up, Nuno quite literally hunted her down and assaulted not only her, but his daughter as well, something he would later deny. Issues between the pair found its origins back in 2006. Nuno, a truck driver, had begun hearing rumours that Tania was cheating on him while he was at work. On one day in 2007, he walked in on Tania with 2 men. They weren't doing anything sexual, but to Nuno, it confirmed his suspicions, and from that day moving forward, he left the home. The 2 men in question were Francisco and Ivo. Francisco and Tania had grown up together and had recently reconnected. Both he and Ivo would often go to Tania's home to have a general catch-up with her. What Francisco didn't know though was that over time, Ivo and Tania began to fall in love with each other, and eventually Tania fell pregnant with Ivo's children. Tania would end up being discharged from the hospital on the day she was admitted. Her injuries weren't serious. The same, however, couldn't be said for 9-year-old Karina. She was alive, but she was in a bad way. The hospital in question wouldn't allow Tania to stay overnight, so she would go to visit her every day. Then came June 5th, and suddenly she stopped turning up. In fact, moving forward, she'd never return to the hospital. Worried something may have happened, her mother, Maria, filed a missing persons report. Around a week later, Tania's brother Mario received this message from her phone number. "I'm sorry for everything I did. I'm fine where I am. Take care of my daughter for me. Don't worry about me. Forgive me for everything." The PJ would end up running Francisco's name through their database to see if he'd been connected with any other missing persons case. And surprise, surprise, he was. He had been present with Tania's mother when she filed that missing persons report back in June of 2008. So he was now connected to 3 separate disappearances. All 3 cases had similarities. They went missing under suspicious circumstances, messages telling family and friends not to worry about them were sent, and they were of course all linked in some way to Francisco. The leading theory at that moment in time was that Francisco more than likely kidnapped them and sold them on for profit. However, when detectives questioned an ex-member of the cult, they learned that they had been approaching this whole situation from the wrong angle. Mara Perez, at one point known as Francisco's right-hand woman, told investigators that in June of 2008, she witnessed Ivo being murdered by Francisco. Francisco attacked Ivo with an iron bar following an argument near the Obidos Lagoon. He fell to the ground with a massive wound to his head. Francisco asked me to help him put Ivo's body in the trunk of his vehicle, so I did. He told me we needed to take him to the hospital, and we started to head that way, but after a short while, I noticed we weren't heading there. Instead, we drove to a cabin in the middle of some woods in the Caldas area. When we arrived, he forced me to carry Ivo's body into the house. I put him inside and there was an open hole. I knew what was going to happen next. I couldn't watch. I was that disgusted I ran outside and vomited all over the place. He reassured me that he was only going to be there temporarily and eventually was going to take him to the hospital. After the incident, I fled from the area in fear for my own life, and I haven't seen him since. Following the discovery, detectives headed over to the cabin, but a body wasn't recovered, nor were there any traces of blood. But they believed Mara's story, and in exchange for her testimony, police agreed not to bring any charges against her. When police spoke to other key witnesses, they figured out that Joana and Tania had more than likely been murdered as well, meaning Francisco was a serial killer. The theory was that at some point in early June of 2008, Francisco found out about Ivo's affair with Tania, and that Tania was pregnant. Furious that she had turned his lover's head, Francisco murdered her in cold blood. That way, he could have Ivo all to himself. It isn't entirely clear what happened in the immediate days after the disappearance, but detectives believe that on the day Ivo was attacked and ultimately killed, he confronted Francisco about having something to do with Tania's disappearance, and so he was murdered as well. Police believe that Francisco murdered Joana for the same reasons he murdered Tania. Luis had been Francisco's new toy boy that he had been raping. However, when Joana came on the scene, Luis had fell in love with her. So he murdered Joana in cold blood so he could have Luis all to himself. Sadly, Tania, Joana and Ivo's bodies were never recovered, but police had a credible theory, a mountain of evidence, and various witnesses who were willing to testify. So in July of 2010, they were ready to make an arrest. Francisco would end up being charged in relation to all 3 homicides and would ultimately plead not guilty. It would take 2 years for the case to finally go to trial. In the end, he was found guilty on all counts and was handed the maximum sentence of just 25 years in prison. This isn't where the story ends. You see, in 2016, Francisco was charged with 542 counts of rape against some of his cult members. He would again plead not guilty. When that case got to court, only 8 of the 542 counts of rape would stand. After the trial, he was found guilty and was handed a 17-year sentence. The sentence was to run concurrent, meaning that the reality of the situation was no extra prison time was added on. There's no specific date given for his release, although it has been reported that he has been well behaved during his time in prison. So according to how things normally go in Portugal, he could be released in just 3 years' time on license. And so that's the story of the YouTube serial killer Francisco Leitão, aka the Gnome King. An interesting case to kick off the spooky season. Before we wrap this video up, I need to not only give a shout out, but also a thanks to Eva from the Portugal de Couto podcast. She not only assisted with the translations that you've seen in the clips on today's video, but also supported with the research. As always, I try my best to do as much in-depth research as possible, but realistically with foreign cases, there's always going to be that language barrier. So I may not catch the smaller details. However, that wasn't the case for this video because of the assist. If there's anyone out there that needs a translation service, or if you're interested in a cult-related podcast, then feel free to go and check her out. I'll leave all of the relevant links in the description of this video. That's all from me, and now a word from the woman herself.
This is still one of the most shocking and infamous cases to ever happen in Portugal. King Gob took vulnerable kids and youths and manipulated them to believe he could speak to their deceased loved ones and prevent spiritual harm to come to them and their family members. He went as far as to convince them that a new era was coming. He would prevent the apocalypse and replace the evil god Raifikul. You know, it takes a cult leader to do that. And that is what you will find with Francisco Leitão. He was unpredictable, exploitative, manipulative. He demanded absolute loyalty and had enough charisma to control the lives of those who were frail enough or gullible enough to believe his special powers. This man is a remorseless rapist, child molester, and a killer. His undue influence was far worse than what both the media and the DA's office could understand when they came across this case. This man will one day be released from jail and free to travel abroad. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I ask you to research what a narcissistic personality disorder is and how the description of a malignant narcissist relates to cult leaders. Francisco Leitão definitely knows right from wrong. He just doesn't care what harm he inflicts onto others as long as he remains king in the court of gnomes. Cases like this are not a commonality in Portugal. In fact, the case you just heard about is still considered to have been the last major serial killer case we've had so far. In 2010, books on witchcraft and spiritism and any other subject of that kind were common in any bookstores. We had our own version of satanic panic much later than the US or the UK, but at that time being a Wiccan was actually a normal thing. But that is in cities like Porto and Lisbon, where years earlier, platforms like Facebook facilitated the growth of alternative communities. In small villages like Lourinhã, however, I can imagine how owning a few books on magic would have been fascinating, if not shocking. Convincing a few kids that he had special powers would not have been that hard, even for an uneducated man like Francisco. This man's supposed belief system is akin to a doomsday cult that was never fully formed. His doctrine is underdeveloped and could really only fool kids, and not all of them at that. It's a mix of Mayan apocalypse predictions, which have been widely disproven, some sort of candomblé, where he incorporates spirits, both good and bad, and magnetism, a bit like Uri Geller, who would still have been a well-known figure in Portugal back then. He adapted bits of spiritual beliefs here and there, and took advantage of the 1755 earthquake that remains in our collective memory. He didn't have to have a doctrine. He just needed to make it look like he knew what he was doing and make stuff up along the way. I think one of the most confusing facts about this case is that Francisco doesn't look like a cult leader, a serial killer, a rapist, or a child molester. He looks like a farmer, a car mechanic, a funny guy who might be a bit flamboyant, but is otherwise harmless. No doubt some people still think of him this way until this very day. Had he not started to kill his cult members, he might still be a free man. His court might even have grown. Along with his perversities, he was able to bring several young people into his circle. Francisco carved out such a reputation for himself that teenagers were quick to fear him, but were equally curious to know what went on inside his weird-looking castle house.